As we were talking about in class last week, the Atlantic world went through profound changes in the late 17th and early 18th centuries that strengthened the bonds between the seat of British Empire in England and their colonies in North America. Now, at heart, these changes were primarily economic. Under the direction of Parliament, a sophisticated transatlantic system of triangular trade was developed, within which the continents of Europe, Africa, and North America each played a distinct economic role in the fostering of imperial power. In this way, the Atlantic Ocean, once an impenetrable barrier, became a bridge connecting the colonies more closely to England. The dramatically expanding colonial population participated in this system as exporters of cash crops like sugar, indigo, rice, and tobacco, and they prospered under this system through the expansion of wealth and the creation of a more diverse class structure in the colonies. As we discussed, the colonists were also consumers of British manufactures like furniture, clothing, newspapers, and tea. And it was this participation in the consumer revolution that helped the colonists see themselves as part of a distinctly British imperial structure. At the same time, this shared British identity had the effect of forging closer bonds between the different colonies themselves, so that British subjects in the northern colonies in New England increasingly had more in common with those in the Chesapeake and the lower South. But it was more than just people and stuff that crossed the Atlantic. The Atlantic was also a world of shared cultural ideas. So before moving on to the main subject of this video, I'd like to highlight just two crucial transatlantic cultural movements that began transforming the colonies and their relationship to the empire. That is, the Great Awakening and the Enlightenment. The first was a religious revival movement known as the Great Awakening. The Great Awakening was a Christian revitalization movement that swept Protestant Europe first and then crossed the Atlantic to the North American colonies in the 1730s and 1740s. The awakening was based on a powerful new preaching style that gave listeners a sense of personal revelation and the deep need for the salvation of Jesus Christ. The rhetoric of revivalist preachers emphasized the potential for every person to break away from the past and start anew in their own relationship with God. Most abandoned ritual and reason and denied that formal education and theological training were the best claims to spiritual authority. Now, expressions of such beliefs opened deep divisions within colonial Christianity and led colonists to identify more closely with fellow believers in other colonies across the Atlantic. The ideals of the awakening and evangelical Christianity promoted egalitarianism and skepticism toward established authority. For example, Baptists, Methodists, and Presbyterians who evangelized Virginia challenged the notion of a hierarchical, official, taxpayer-supported religion to which all must at least theoretically belong. Their preaching and their efforts shaped the thinking of people like James Madison and Thomas Jefferson in their views concerning the separation of church and state. The awakening promoted a democratic, egalitarian union of cross-colonial scope, breaking down the individual denominations in colonies and linking them in this revivalist movement. The awakening promoted a democratic, egalitarian union of cross-colonial scope. So you can see here in this map of the travels of the revivalist preacher George Whitefield. His travels take him all up and down the colonial Atlantic seaboard. And in this way, the message of the style of evangelical preaching is spread and shared among the various colonies. It's also shared by the printing press and the printing of sermons and information that travels also up and down the colonial scope as part of the spread of intellectual ideas in the Atlantic world. This promoted the belief in a free press, the belief that information should be shared openly. It helped create the demand for the separation of church and state, and it helped foster an optimism about America's religious destiny and a positive sense of unity. So evangelicals helped to reconceive the relationship of the individual to the community and to society, so that people who could be able to decide for themselves to which community they wished to belong. Another very different cultural upheaval in the colonies was the Enlightenment. Now, the Enlightenment was a product of scientific and intellectual discoveries in Europe in the 17th century, discoveries that revealed the so-called natural laws that regulated the workings of nature. This knowledge encouraged many thinkers to celebrate the power of human reason and to argue that rational thought, not just religious faith, could create progress and advance knowledge of the world and human society. In the early 17th century, Enlightenment ideas in the colonies were borrowed mostly from Europe as another example of the integration of the Atlantic world. Through newspapers as well as the bookshops and libraries that began appearing in the urban centers in the colonies, the ideas of the Enlightenment circulated widely. And like their counterparts in Europe, American colonists shared ideas about the concepts that were spreading, concepts like the idea of natural rights from John Locke, or the separation of powers in government from Montesquieu. Ideas of like freedom of speech being promoted by Voltaire in France, and new conceptions of how to properly structure the relationship between government and the people from philosophers such as Rousseau and his social contract. These ideas spread through the more profound communication taking place among the colonies and with their counterparts across the Atlantic Ocean. Now later, Americans like Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Paine, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison would make significant contributions to Enlightenment thought. What is interesting about these developments that we're talking about as a whole, consumerism, religious revival, the Enlightenment, is that they had the dual effect of tightening connections among the colonies and between the colonies and England across the Atlantic. Over this period, colonists in North America were coming to see themselves as more, not less, British in their identity. As late as the 1750s, very few Americans objected to their place in the British Empire. American colonists benefited greatly from the imperial system of the Atlantic world, and for the most part, the English government left the colonies alone. But by the mid-1770s, however, the relationship between the colonies and their British rulers had become so strained that the empire was on the verge of unraveling. And in the spring of 1777, the first shots were fired in a war that would ultimately lead to independence and the creation of the United States of America. How had that happened? And why did it happen so quickly? In a sense, it wasn't quick at all. As we discussed in class last week, the ideas and institutions of the colonies have been diverging from those of Britain all along. From the founding of Jamestown in 1607, imperial administration of the colonies had been loose, decentralized, and inefficient. Parliament saw fit to allow colonial assemblies a degree of autonomy to handle their own taxes, to approve appointments, pass laws, and handle their own defense. These assemblies came to look upon themselves as little parliaments, each acting with an attitude of sovereignty within its colony, just as Parliament did back in England. In this sense, their autonomy made them feel even more British. But in another sense, the revolutionary crisis emerged from very sudden changes in Parliament's administration of the British Empire, and the key event that brought about these changes was a major imperial war fought between the English, the French, and the Iroquois nations of North America. This conflict, known in Europe as the 7 Years' War, and in the colonies as the French and Indian War, has been described by historians as one of the most important wars in modern history, and maybe the first truly global war. The 7 Years' War ended up being a stunning victory for Britain, confirming England's commercial supremacy in the Atlantic world and dominance of the settled regions of North America. It also brought about dramatic changes in the relationship between Britain and its colonies that would fuel the American Revolution. So the question to ask yourself now is, how did the 7 Years' War, also known as the French and Indian War, contribute to the colonial conflict with Britain that would lead to the American Revolution? The conflict in North America, known as the French and Indian War, that began in 1754, was only a small part of a much larger and longer series of wars that had been racking Europe for almost 100 years. Competition for power in Europe was fierce and driven by imperial rivalries, chief among them a seemingly endless struggle between Britain and France for dominance on the European continent. European powers combined into alliances and counter-alliances, such as the British alliance with Austria against the French and the French alliance with Prussia against the British. To make things even more complicated, these conflicts had a religious dimension in the long aftermath of the Protestant Reformation, pitting Protestant Britain against Catholic France. Now, until the 1730s, these wars of empire were fought primarily in Europe itself, with the colonies of both Britain and France out on the periphery of the conflict. But this situation was changing rapidly in the 18th century, as the colonies were becoming more and more important to the power of the European empires. As France expanded its control of North America, especially to the port of New Orleans, which gave it a presence in the West Indies, the powerful British Navy worked to prevent this expansion and eventually stripped France of its colonial holdings. This is why the coming war between Britain and France in this age of global imperialism will be fought not only in Europe, but also in India, the Caribbean, and most significantly, North America. Now, when you take a look at it on the map, French America looked really formidable. It was vast, including a great swath of Canada, the entire Mississippi River and its delta, Louisiana, and the continental interior as far as the Rocky Mountains in the west and the Rio Grande in the south. Everything you see there on that map in blue. But French strength was deceptive. Whereas the British colonies along the Atlantic were experiencing, as we saw last week, incredible population growth over the 17th and 18th centuries, the French population in North America was much smaller and sparse, clustered around a string of fortifications in the St. Lawrence River Valley, most notably the capital in Quebec. Much further south, the key port city of New Orleans was as large as some of those on the Atlantic seaboard, and the French were eager to strengthen the Mississippi corridor to tighten imperial control. The balance of power in North America depended almost entirely on the Indians. Both the French and the English were aware that the battle for control of North America would be determined in part by who could best win the allegiance of the native tribes. Skilled at guerrilla warfare, Indians dominated the forest passages between the rival empires. They could obstruct the advance of their colonial enemy and destroy outlying settlements. Divided into many tribes and subdivided into hundreds of autonomous villages, Indian peoples were further riven by factional divisions among themselves, led by rival chiefs. They benefited from the rivalry, played Europeans off of each other, and demanded abundant gifts from both sides. The English, with their more advanced commercial economy, could usually offer the Indians better and more plentiful goods, but the French offered tolerance. In the upper country, the French had, over the previous centuries, developed an effective alliance with powerful Indian nations based on the fur trade. A middle ground of mutual accommodation developed and endured between the French and the Indians because neither side had the ability to dominate the other, and had to deal with each other as equals. Already at odds with the formidable Iroquois, the French needed the Western Indians as allies and could not afford them as enemies. The most powerful native group, however, had remained aloof from both sides. This was the Iroquois Confederacy. 5 nations, the Mohawk, the Seneca, Cayuga, Onoga, Onondaga, and the Oneida, that had formed a powerful defensive alliance in the 15th century, were the most powerful presence in the Ohio Valley. The Iroquois nations enjoyed a strategic location along all the major waterways between French Canada and the British colony of New York. Although numbering only about 2,000 warriors in 1720, the Iroquois were extremely important to both the French and the British. And by the mid-18th century, Indian leaders recognized that the power was now shifting in British favor. In 1754, the 1.5 million British colonists immensely outnumbered the 70,000 French in North America. The Iroquois maintained their independence by trading successfully with both the French and the English, and played them off each other and against rival Indian tribes. However, the Indians were not the only groups divided among themselves. As tension mounted in the borderlands, it was clear that there was a deep division among the British colonists themselves. Competition was rife among the colonies. There was no common defense, no centralized authority in the colonies, and there were no established institutions to organize for collective action and defense. Although the colonies had slowly learned to cooperate with one another on some practical matters, they were reluctant to unite in larger ways, even when, in 1754, they faced a common threat from the French and from France's Indian allies. In fact, delegates from Pennsylvania, Maryland, New York, and New England met in Albany in 1754 to negotiate a treaty with the Iroquois. There, Benjamin Franklin proposed setting up what he wanted to call a general government of the colonies to coordinate policy and defense on the frontier. Although this union would have strengthened the colonial position, it would also mean transferring some elements of colonial autonomy to the new Congress being proposed by Franklin. Jealous of their individual power, none of the colonial assemblies approved it. And much to Franklin's dismay, his attempt to form more unity among the colonies was a failure. These factors combined to create a potentially explosive situation. The rising set of tensions between the French and British, alliances and conflicts between Europeans and Indians, and rivalries between the British colonies themselves. So long as some measure of peace and stability in the North American interior lasted, English and French colonists coexisted without serious difficulty. But this stability was now deteriorating due to the larger imperial conflicts now raging. As the English moved further into the interior and the Iroquois began granting trading concessions to English merchants for the first time, the French feared correctly the English were using the concessions as a first step towards expansion into French lands. And so they began constructing new fortresses in the Ohio River Valley, to which the English responded with fortresses of their own. The balance of power began disintegrating. In the summer of 1754, the fire that would become the French and Indian War was lit in the Ohio River Valley by a group of Virginians called the Ohio Company, which claimed the area. Knowing this land was disputed by the French and the native Indians, the governor of Virginia sent a militia force of 160 colonists and Indian allies, led by a young and inexperienced colonel named George Washington, to make claim to the territory. The 22-year-old Washington was eager to make a mark for himself, hoping this would launch him toward a career as a British military officer. Washington built a very crude stockade called Fort Necessity, not far from France's Fort Duquesne in present-day Pittsburgh, and after an unsuccessful attack on a French detachment, the French countered with an assault on Fort Necessity, trapping Washington and his soldiers inside. After one-third of them died in the fighting, Washington surrendered, making his first military outing an embarrassing failure. This was the beginning of the French and Indian War. The war would last nearly 9 years and move through 3 distinct phases. In the first phase, beginning with the debacle at Fort Necessity, it was primarily a local conflict, and the major players were the British and the French colonists and the Native Americans. Nearly all tribes in the area, aside from the Iroquois, were allied with the French, and they launched a series of raids all along the western English settlements, pushing many English settlers east of the Allegheny Mountains by 1755. The second phase of the conflict began in 1756, when the larger 7 Years' War erupted in Europe and beyond. In this phase, the imperial war spread to the West Indies, to India, and across Europe itself. But the principal struggle remained in North America, where so far England had suffered nothing but defeat and humiliation. At first, the war revealed the weakness of the British colonial system. British Army officers and troops arrived from across the Atlantic, from their perspective, to lead the campaigns in North America. But the colonies continued to mobilize defense through their distinctive militia systems. This was the first major meeting of the British forces with colonists, and it revealed serious differences of opinions about authority. One problem that was endemic to the history of the colonies related to that Anglo-American militias are disobeying British commanders sent to lead, refusing to take British orders, and there was no central organization for the war. Then, in 1757, William Pitt, the English Secretary of State and future Prime Minister of England, began bringing the war fully under British control. William Pitt threw massive funds into the war, using the empire's treasury to ensure victory for the British. In this, the third phase of the French and Indian War, William Pitt planned military strategy, appointed commanders, and issued orders to the British colonists. British commanders began forcibly enlisting colonists into the army in a common military practice known as impressment. Officers also seized supplies from local farmers and tradesmen and compelled colonists to offer shelter to British troops, often without compensation. Now, this was a historic moment in the relationship between the Empire and the colonists. It was the first time that British colonists in North America encountered the power of the British Army and experienced the reality of what it meant to be British in a military sense. The colonists, long accustomed to autonomy of their colonial militias, now learned firsthand about army discipline, including corporal punishment and executions for disobeying direct orders. By 1758, the friction between the British authorities and the colonists was threatening to bring the war to a halt, and the experience would be something that the colonists would not forget, contributing to the deteriorations of relations after the war. However, in this third phase of the war, begun in 1758, Pitt's efforts to whip up the ragtag colonial army into shape began to pay off. He relaxed some of the harsher policies and threw more money and resources into the war, which effectively turned the tide of battle in England's favor. During the war, Pitt tried to appease the Indians. The British sent many goods and gifts deep into Indian territory. They made attempts to redress Indian grievances against British incursions. In 1758, they signed the Treaty of Easton, in which the British made a promise to respect Indian possessions and their land after the war. This led many Indians to abandon the French and ally with the British. British regulars and colonial militias began seizing one French stronghold after the other. Fort Duquesne was captured without a fight in 1758. The next year, at the siege of Quebec, the English army surprised the French forces and defeated them. Quebec fell to the British in September 1759, marking the end of the American phase of the war, and the French formally surrendered a year later in Montreal. British victory in the French and Indian War completely rewrote the map of North America. Peace came in 1763 with the Peace of Paris, by which the French ceded to Great Britain some of their West Indies islands, most of their colonies in India and Canada, and all other French territory in North America east of the Mississippi. The French then relinquished New Orleans and claims west of the Mississippi to Spain, surrendering all claims to North America. The era of New France was over. Now, although Britain emerged from the war the unquestioned master of North America, its victory came at a great cost. For one thing, the war substantially increased British resentment of the American colonists, and vice versa. English leaders were contemptuous of the colonists for what they saw as military ineptitude and insubordination during the war. They were angry that the colonies made so few financial contributions to the struggle they waged, as they believed largely for colonial benefit. They were particularly angry that some colonial merchants had been selling food and supplies to the French in the West Indies all throughout the conflict. All of this combined to convince many English leaders that a major reorganization of the empire would be necessary to increase London's authority over the colonies. For their part, American colonists were equally affected by the war. It was an experience that forced them for the first time to act together against a common enemy, the French, and they came to experience what it really meant to be part of the British Empire, not long forgetting their relegation to grunt work, harsh military discipline, barriers to advancement in the army, floggings, and even executions. This was a long way from the feeling of being British by drinking tea, simply drinking tea. Furthermore, the colonists saw that the British military presence on the colonial frontier did not end with the conclusion of the war. Uninvited to the peace negotiations after the war, Britain's Iroquois allies seethed over what they perceived as deception and betrayal of promises made to them during the conflict. The fragile alliance unraveled as the Iroquois contested Britain and the colonists for control of the Ohio Valley. To make their situation worse, frontiersmen from the English colonies, emboldened by the victory against the French, began immediately to move over the mountains and into tribal lands in the upper Ohio Valley that had been promised safely to them by the British during the war. This inspired a massive rebellion of Indian tribes under the leadership of the Ottawa chieftain Pontiac, in which 8 English posts were burned to the ground and many more were captured, in what became known as Pontiac's Rebellion. Fearing that escalation of the fighting might threaten trade, the British government declared the Proclamation Line of 1763, which forbade settlers to advance beyond the Appalachian Mountains. Many colonists were incensed by the Proclamation Line, which was a major check on their own territorial ambitions, which they believed they had fought the French to achieve. And British policy inspired further resentment among colonists on the frontier, when the army left behind a frontier force of 10,000 British soldiers to guard against future hostilities. British authorities were convinced that colonial militias were undisciplined, uncoordinated, and incapable of common defense. To the more conspiratorial among the colonists, this frontier force lined up all around the western side of the colonies looked suspiciously like military occupation of the colonial frontier, another thing that would contribute to the coming conflict between the colonies and Britain. But without question, the most significant consequence of the war was the staggering war debt that it left for the British Empire. Pitt's victory literally came at a price. To pay for the war, the British government had borrowed heavily, to the tune of some 123 million pounds silver. With the Treaty of 1763, Britain was now the greatest military power in one of the greatest military powers in the world, and in possession of a massive empire to administer and defend. With its responsibilities only increasing, the imperial government believed it must increase its administrative capacities by targeting the American colonies in order to pay for the financial responsibilities. So the big question that emerged at the end of the French and Indian War, of direct relevance to the coming of the American Revolution, was: how will Britain pay this massive debt and finance its empire?